They said the children of lost saints simply disappeared whenever the winter trains arrived at midnight. But one black horse kept stopping beside the railroad tracks, smelling blood buried beneath the snow. A lonely cowboy known only as the Rider soon uncovered a frozen town hiding orphan children inside locked freight cars. While the church prayed for survival, innocent kids were being sold into the darkness beyond the mountains. And in the middle of the storm, a wounded horse became the only soul brave enough to stand in front of a moving train. Tonight's story is about fear, guilt, forgotten children, and the small miracles God sometimes sends through broken people and loyal animals. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more cinematic stories with The Rider and Ghost. The wind came first. Not snow, not the railroad, not the dying town hidden beneath the white hills of the north. Just the wind, dragging itself across the frozen plains with a sound like rusted metal screaming somewhere far away in the dark. The rider pulled his coat tighter as Ghost carried him along the narrow trail beside the railway tracks. Snow clung to the long brown duster hanging from his shoulders, turning the leather stiff with ice. At 45, he looked older whenever winter came. Cold always had a way of digging old graves back out of a man's face. His beard had gone rough and uneven over the years, black fading slowly into gray around the chin. Deep lines carved themselves around his mouth from too many nights, sleeping beside dying fires, and too many mornings waking somewhere he did not belong. Under the shadow of his worn black hat, his eyes stayed fixed ahead, sharp, gray-brown, and constantly searching. Ghost walked slower than usual. The large black quarter horse normally moved with calm confidence, but tonight the animal's muscles were tight beneath the saddle blanket. Frost clung to the horse's dark mane. A faded white mark rested between his eyes like an old scar touched by moonlight. Ghost was not nervous often. Years beside gunfire, storms, wolves, and dying men had taught the horse what danger smelled like. And tonight, something smelled wrong. The rider noticed it before the horse stopped entirely. Ghost froze beside the railroad tracks. The horse lowered his head slowly toward the snow. His ears twitched once, then again. The rider sighed quietly. "What is it, old boy?" Ghost did not move. Wind hissed across the rails. The horse inhaled sharply near the frozen ground, then suddenly struck the snow with one heavy hoof. Once, twice, again. The rider slid down from the saddle, boots crunching into ice. His knees hurt worse these days whenever cold settled into them. He crouched beside the disturbed snow and brushed the powder away with his gloved hand. Something dark appeared beneath the white. A child's scarf, small enough to belong to someone no older than 10. Wool, gray once, now stained dark brown. Frozen blood. The rider stared at it for a long moment without speaking. Ghost stepped closer behind him and lowered his nose beside the scarf again. The horse breathed uneasily through his nostrils, then turned his head toward the railroad, disappearing north into the storm. The rider looked the same direction. "Fresh?" he asked quietly. Ghost shifted his weight. That was answer enough. Far away, hidden somewhere beyond the white hills, a train whistle cried through the darkness. The rider closed his hand around the scarf. For a brief second, something old and painful moved behind his eyes. A memory. Small hands beside a fire, a child coughing through winter, morning coming too late. He pushed the thought away before it could fully surface. "Come on," he muttered, climbing back into the saddle. "Let's see what kind of town leaves blood buried beside railroad tracks." Lost saints appeared slowly through the storm like a dying memory refusing to disappear. The town sat low between frozen hills, wrapped around the railroad that kept it alive. Smoke rose weakly from chimneys. Lanterns glowed faintly behind frost-covered windows. Most buildings leaned slightly under years of brutal winters. The church stood above everything else on the eastern hill, its dark steeple cutting into the snowy sky like a broken finger accusing heaven itself. The rider saw hungry faces watching him from windows as he rode through town. Nobody waved, nobody smiled. People here had learned long ago not to waste warmth on strangers. Ghost noticed them too. The horse's ears kept shifting toward every movement, toward every sudden silence. Near the station, several railroad workers stopped loading coal when they saw the rider pass. Their faces looked hollow beneath layers of wool and soot. One man crossed himself quickly when Ghost turned his head toward him. Fear lived here. Not loud fear, quiet fear. The kind people carried so long, it eventually became part of their bones. The saloon sat near the center of town beneath a faded wooden sign that read, Vale House. Warm yellow light spilled through the windows onto the snow outside. Inside, the smell of whiskey, wet wool, smoke, and exhaustion wrapped around the room. Conversation died almost immediately when the rider entered. Ghost remained, outside beneath the awning, but the horse kept staring toward the railroad tracks instead of resting. The rider removed his gloves slowly and approached the counter. That was where he first saw Mara Vale. She looked somewhere in her early 40s, though hard winters had added years to her face. Her dark brown hair was tied loosely behind her neck, streaked faintly with gray near the temples. She had sharp cheekbones, pale skin roughened by cold weather, and tired green eyes that missed very little. Unlike most people in Los Saints, she did not look away when meeting someone's gaze. There was strength in her posture, not violence, survival, the kind carried by people forced to bury grief before they finished mourning. "You passing through?" she asked while drying a glass with a cloth. Her voice sounded calm but careful. The rider nodded once. "Depends what's waiting north." Mara glanced briefly toward the railroad outside. "That depends what's hunting you." The rider placed the blood-stained scarf on the counter. For the first time, Mara's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. "You know who this belongs to?" he asked. She stared at the scarf too long before answering. "No." Lie, not a practiced one either, a tired one. The rider noticed. So did Ghost outside. The horse suddenly lifted his head toward the northern tracks. Something distant echoed through the storm. Metal, movement. Ghost stepped away from the saloon wall and stared into the darkness with growing tension. Inside, Mara poured whiskey into a glass, but never drank it. "Children disappear here," the rider said quietly. Not a question. Mara remained silent. The saloon around them felt suddenly smaller. Finally, she spoke without looking at him. "Winter changes people." The rider waited. She continued. "When food runs low long enough, folks stop asking questions they're afraid to hear answered." A man near the stove muttered angrily under his breath, but nobody challenged her. Mara leaned closer across the counter. "For 2 years I've written down names." Her voice lowered. "Kids, drifters, orphans, children nobody comes looking for." The rider's eyes narrowed slightly. "How many?" Mara swallowed once. "Too many." Outside, Ghost suddenly jerked hard against the hitching post rope. Not panic, urgency. The rider turned immediately. The horse stared directly toward the railroad station. Then Ghost let out a low sound deep in his throat, unlike anything the rider had heard from him in months. Not fear. Warning. Every conversation inside the saloon stopped. Even Mara noticed it. The rider stepped outside into the snow just as the distant whistle of a night train rolled through the valley. Ghost pawed violently at the frozen ground. The rider grabbed the reins. "Easy." But Ghost yanked forward suddenly, hard. The rider almost lost his footing as the horse dragged him toward the station through the storm. People watched from doorways as horse and rider disappeared into the swirling snow. The train was already moving when they reached the yard. Black smoke poured upward into the night. Iron wheels screamed against frozen rails. Workers avoided looking directly at the passing freight cars. Ghost moved beside the tracks restlessly, nostrils flaring hard. Then the rider saw them, small footprints, children's footprints, fresh. Beside them, long drag marks cut through the snow toward one locked freight car near the end of the train. The rider reached for his revolver instinctively. Too late. The freight car disappeared deeper into the storm as the train gained speed. Ghost stood beside the rails, breathing heavily. Then the horse lowered his head toward the tracks. Blood. Fresh. The rider looked north as the train vanished into darkness. Behind him, lost saints remained silent, not because the town knew nothing, because it knew everything. Morning came gray and bitter over lost saints. The storm from the night before had not fully passed, only weakened enough to let pale light leak through the clouds like something dying slowly behind them. Frost covered the railroad tracks in thick silver lines, and smoke rose from chimneys across town in thin, exhausted streams. Nothing in Lost Saints looked alive for long. Even the church bell sounded tired. The rider rode uphill toward St. Abel with Ghost, moving carefully beneath him, through the deep snow. The black horse seemed calmer than the night before, but not relaxed. Ghost's ears kept shifting toward distant sounds no human would notice. Every few steps the horse lifted his head toward the orphanage buildings beyond the churchyard, as if listening for something hidden beneath the wind. St. Abel Church stood above the town like an aging gravestone. The wood along its walls had darkened from years of snow and smoke. Parts of the roof sagged beneath frozen weight. The cross above the steeple leaned slightly eastward, as though winter itself had been slowly dragging God down toward the earth. Beside the church sat the orphan house, long, narrow, cold. The rider could tell from the windows alone. Children lived there without laughter. Ghost slowed before the gate. The horse stared toward the graveyard instead. Rows of crooked wooden crosses disappeared beneath snowdrifts. Most had no flowers. Some had no names anymore. The rider climbed down from the saddle and tied Ghost near the fence. Before he could walk toward the church door, he noticed a figure standing beneath the bell tower. Father Callow. The old priest looked taller from a distance, but age had hollowed him out badly. His black coat hung loose over narrow shoulders. Snow dusted the thinning gray hair above his temples. Deep lines cut through his pale face, especially around the mouth, as if guilt itself had slowly carved them there over many winters. His hands shook faintly even while standing still, but it was his eyes that stayed with people, not cruel eyes, tired ones, the kind belonging to men who once believed in something deeply and then spent years watching themselves betray it, little by little. "You're the drifter from town," Callow said quietly. His voice carried exhaustion more than suspicion. The rider nodded once. "You're the man ringing bells over hungry graves." Callow looked toward the cemetery. "Someone has to." The rider studied him carefully. Most guilty men avoided silence. Father Callow almost seemed to drown inside it willingly. "You lose many children here?" the rider asked. The priest's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Winter takes people." "That wasn't my question." For a long moment, the old man said nothing. Snow drifted between them. Finally, Callow spoke softly. "I had a daughter once." The rider did not interrupt. "She was 6 years old when the fever came." The priest stared somewhere far beyond the hills now. "There wasn't enough wood that winter. Not enough medicine either. I held her hands all night, waiting for morning." His breathing slowed painfully. "She died before sunrise." The rider watched Ghost behind him. The horse had stopped staring toward the graveyard. Now Ghost watched Callow, carefully. When she died, the priest continued, I swore no child around this town would freeze the way she did. Something heavy settled behind the words. Not confession. Memory. The rider understood enough men to recognize when grief had turned poisonous. You made a deal, he said quietly. Father Callow finally looked at him directly. The silence between them answered everything. Children fed in exchange for labor, warmth traded for innocence, and somewhere along the line, survival stopped looking different from sin. The church bell suddenly rang overhead. Both men flinched slightly, not because of the sound, because of what followed it. Children. The orphanage doors opened, and several boys stepped outside, carrying buckets towards the frozen pump. None looked older than 12. Thin coats hung from their shoulders, hollow faces, eyes too old for childhood. One boy stayed near the doorway instead of joining the others. Small, thin, watching, Noah. His dark brown hair looked uneven, as if cut with a knife months ago. His oversized wool coat nearly swallowed him whole. Bruises yellowed faintly beneath one eye, but the strangest thing about him was how still he stood. Children usually fidgeted. Noah watched like prey. The moment Ghost saw the boy, the horse lifted his head and exhaled softly. Noah stared back, then slowly, cautiously, he walked toward the fence. Father Callow noticed and stiffened slightly. That boy doesn't trust strangers. He shouldn't, the rider replied. Noah stopped several feet away from Ghost. The wind pushed snowflakes across his face, but he barely blinked. Slowly, the boy reached into his pocket and pulled out half of a dried apple. Ghost remained completely still. No sudden movement, no impatience. The large black horse lowered his head gently enough for the boy to offer the apple from shaking fingers. Only then did Noah smile, very slightly. The first real warmth the rider had seen in Lost Saints. That afternoon, snow began falling harder again. The rider helped chop wood behind the church, mostly to watch people unnoticed. He saw railroad workers delivering coal to the orphanage, saw Sister Agnes directing children inside with nervous sharpness. She was a narrow-faced woman in her 50s with pale skin and severe eyes that never softened. Her gray habit moved stiffly in the wind as if even cloth feared disappointing her. She did not look cruel exactly, just frightened enough to become obedient to cruelty. Nobody here seemed truly evil. That bothered the rider more. Evil was easier, hunger was harder. As dusk approached, Ghost became restless again. The horse paced near the back fence repeatedly, not toward the church, toward the storage barn behind the orphanage. The rider noticed it immediately. Ghost rarely wasted energy. The horse stopped near the barn door and inhaled sharply through his nostrils. Then he backed away, uneasy. The rider approached slowly. At first he smelled only wood, snow, and old hay. Then something else emerged beneath it. Iron, rot, sweat, and underneath all of it, blood, old blood. Ghost suddenly turned his head toward the barn wall. The rider followed the movement and noticed scratches carved low into the wood. Not animal scratches, finger marks. Small ones. A cold heaviness settled into his chest. Then came the rehook. Ghost stepped sideways unexpectedly and pressed himself against Noah, who had silently appeared behind the fence, without the rider noticing. The boy looked terrified now, staring directly at the barn door. His lips trembled slightly. Then he whispered, "They cry in there at night." The rider felt the world narrow around those words, not because of fear, because Noah spoke them like someone describing weather, something ordinary, something repeated too many times. Ghost lowered his head against the boy's shoulder, and Noah began shaking so hard he nearly fell. The rider looked back at the barn. The scratches on the wood suddenly looked deeper, human, desperate. He waited until full dark before returning. The storm covered sound well enough. The barn lock broke quietly beneath the barrel of his revolver. Inside smelled worse. Oil lamps hung low across the beams. Rope coils sat stacked near crates. Small winter coats were folded carelessly along one wall. Chains rested beside railroad cargo hooks. The rider moved slowly through the shadows. Every object inside had been arranged by people pretending this was work instead of butchery. Then he found the ledger. Train schedules, dates, numbers beside children's names. Transferred, delivered, paid. His jaw tightened harder with every page. Near the back wall sat a pile of broken belongings left behind by frightened children who never returned. Shoes, scarves, wooden toys, and there, half buried beneath a torn blanket, a wooden doll missing one arm. The rider picked it up carefully. The face had been painted by hand once. Faded blue eyes, tiny stitched dress. One side blackened slightly by smoke. Something inside him shifted painfully. For one brief second, another winter rose from memory. A small child sleeping beside a fire, tiny fingers gripping his sleeve. Snow outside, silence by morning. The rider closed his eyes. Ghost suddenly stomped outside the barn. Warning! Voices approached through the storm. The rider slipped the ledger inside his coat and stared once more at the broken doll in his hand. Then he tucked it carefully beside the blood-stained scarf from the railroad tracks. Outside, the church bell began ringing again, and somewhere far below the hill, another train whistle echoed through the dark. The storm deepened by nightfall. Snow rolled through Lost Saints in long white waves that swallowed fences, wagons, and footprints within minutes. The railroad tracks vanished beneath frost except where steel still reflected pale moonlight through the blizzard. Somewhere beyond the hills, another freight engine groaned against the mountains like a dying animal refusing to collapse. Inside the Vale House saloon, the lamps burned low. Mara Vale sat across from the rider at a corner table near the stove, while the rest of the room pretended not to listen. Her sharp green eyes looked more exhausted tonight. Dark circles rested beneath them like bruises carved by too many sleepless winters. She smoked slowly, one elbow resting on the table, fingers trembling slightly whenever the wind screamed outside. The rider placed the ledger from the orphan barn between them. Mara stared at it silently, then her face lost what little color remained. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. The rider leaned back in the chair. "You recognize the names?" "Some." Her voice tightened. "Not all." She opened the pages carefully. Children's names, dates, rail numbers, payment marks beside certain transfers, delivered, processed, paid. The language made the rider sick in ways violence never had. Mara swallowed hard. "This ain't just Lost Saints." The rider said nothing. She continued quietly. "The northern rail line runs through 6 mining territories before the mountains. Nobody checks cargo much during winter. Too cold, too remote." Her fingers stopped over one page. "Some of those camps buy workers cheap. Adults cost money. Children don't complain as long before they die." A long silence settled between them. Near the stove, several railroad workers drank whiskey without speaking. One of them glanced repeatedly toward the ledger. The rider noticed. The man finally stood and approached slowly. His name was Elias Boone, late 30s, broad shoulders ruined by years of railroad labor. His beard grew uneven across a weather-beaten face, permanently stained with coal dust around the jawline. One eye carried a faint twitch whenever he became nervous. His right hand missed 2 fingers, lost beneath a coupling chain. Accident years earlier. Men like Boone survived because they learned to lower their heads before powerful people noticed them. But tonight he looked tired of lowering it. "You should put that thing away," Boone muttered quietly. The rider studied him. "Why?" "Because Silas already knows somebody's asking questions." Mara stiffened. The rider motioned toward the empty chair. "Sit." Boone hesitated before lowering himself slowly across from them. "I ain't a brave man," Boone admitted immediately. "You ought to know that before listening to anything I say." "Most brave men end up buried," Mara answered. Boone gave a weak, humorless smile. "That's true enough." Snow rattled hard against the windows. The railroad worker leaned closer. "Silas Crow's got men watching the station every night now, ever since the drifters showed up." He glanced at the rider briefly. "One of the guards found broken barn locks this morning." The rider remained expressionless. Boone continued. "There's an old freight car near the south rail line, detached from the others. They use it before transfers." His voice dropped lower. "Sometimes—" He stopped. "Say it," Mara whispered. Boone stared into his whiskey. "Sometimes you can hear kids scratching inside." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The rider finally stood. Mara grabbed his sleeve instantly. "You go down there tonight, you'll walk into an ambush." "Probably." "That ain't a plan." The rider looked toward the frosted window where Ghost stood outside beneath falling snow. "Never said it was." Ghost was already waiting when he stepped into the storm. The black horse shifted uneasily the moment the rider approached. Frost coated the animal's dark mane. Steam rose from his nostrils in thick bursts, but it was Ghost's eyes that mattered most tonight. Focused, alert, listening. The rider secured the revolver beneath his coat and climbed into the saddle. "You hear them too?" he asked quietly. Ghost turned immediately toward the southern tracks. That was answer enough. The freight yard looked abandoned beneath the blizzard. Tall stacks of timber and coal crates cast crooked shadows through the snow. Lanterns swung weakly beside loading platforms while railroad chains rattled softly in the wind. Most workers had disappeared indoors hours ago. Most, not all. Ghost slowed near the detached freight car Boone described. Old, rust-covered, one broken wheel half buried beneath ice. The rider slid silently from the saddle. Ghost approached the railcar first. The horse lowered his head beside the frozen wood panels and inhaled deeply, then his ears pinned backward. Not anger, distress. The rider stepped closer. At first he heard only wind, then scratch, very faint, like tiny fingernails against wood. The rider's heartbeat slowed dangerously. Ghost stamped once against the snow. The smell hit seconds later. Urine, blood, fear. Human fear had its own smell after enough years around death. The rider gripped the lock, then came the rehook. Before he could force it open, Ghost suddenly turned his head sharply towards the darkness behind the rail yard and let out a low warning sound deep in his chest. The rider froze instantly. At first he saw nothing, then movement. Not men. A child, small, barefoot, standing briefly between the snowfall and shadows near another rail car. Watching them, the figure vanished almost immediately into the storm. The rider stared after it. Ghost continued looking the same direction, breathing heavily now. For one impossible second, the rider remembered another winter years ago, another starving child staring through snow beside railroad tracks before disappearing by morning, dead, taken, abandoned. He never learned. The memory struck hard enough to hollow his chest. Then the scratching came again from inside the freight car. Real. Alive. The rider snapped back to the present and smashed the lock loose with the butt of his revolver. The heavy door groaned open. The smell inside nearly knocked him backward. Rotting straw, old blood, human waste. Tiny chains bolted low into the walls. Ghost recoiled immediately, ears flattening hard. In the darkness beneath piled coal sacks, something moved, weakly, a child. The rider dropped to one knee fast and pulled the sacks aside. A little girl stared up at him with hollow gray eyes too exhausted, even for fear. She could not have been older than 8. Her blonde hair stuck together in dirty, frozen knots around her face. Bruises darkened both wrists where rope had rubbed skin raw. She looked barely conscious. The rider removed his coat immediately and wrapped it around her. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The girl swallowed painfully before answering. "Clara." Ghost stepped closer behind him and lowered his nose toward the child. Clara flinched at first, then slowly reached trembling fingers toward the horse's face. Ghost stood perfectly still. Outside, boots suddenly crunched through snow. Voices, men. The rider cursed under his breath. Lantern light appeared beyond the rail cars. Silas's guards, 4 of them, maybe more, hidden behind the storm. The first man into view carried a shotgun beneath a thick railroad coat. Big shoulders, red beard crusted with ice, scar across the bridge of his nose. His name, according to Boone, was Mercer Flint, a former mining enforcer known for beating workers who slowed production. "Found him," Flint shouted. Gunfire exploded instantly. The rider dragged Clara behind the freight car as pellets tore through wood overhead. Ghost jerked sideways violently but did not run. More shots cracked through the blizzard. The rider fired once. A scream answered from somewhere beyond the snow, but survival came from chaos tonight, not skill. Wind blinded everyone equally. One railroad worker deliberately fired too high. Another pretended to reload slower than necessary. Not heroes, just tired men finally hesitating. Ghost suddenly slammed sideways into the rider, hard enough to knock him behind steel wheels. A bullet shattered wood exactly where his head had been. Seconds earlier, the horse had heard the shooter first. The rider fired back blindly through snow. Mercer Flint cursed somewhere ahead. Then Ghost lunged forward. The huge black horse crashed directly into a gunman emerging from the storm. The impact hurled the man sideways beneath the tracks. With a scream, the rider grabbed Clara and moved fast toward the loading sheds, while bullets ripped through snowfall behind them. Then something slipped from inside his coat. The wooden doll. It hit the snow unnoticed. The rider kept moving, but Ghost stopped. For one dangerous second, the horse turned back through gunfire and stormed toward the fallen doll, half buried in white. The rider shouted sharply. Ghost ignored him. The black horse lowered his head, picked up the broken doll carefully between his teeth, and ran back through the blizzard beside them as gunshots echoed behind the rail yard. The blizzard swallowed Lost Saints whole by midnight. Snow hammered rooftops hard enough to shake loose old wood from the buildings. Wind screamed through the railroad lines and turned every lantern glow into a trembling blur behind white curtains of ice. The town looked less like a place people lived and more like something winter had already begun burying. Inside the cellar beneath the Vale House saloon, frightened children huddled together beneath blankets, while Mara moved quietly between them carrying bowls of thin soup. The cellar smelled of smoke, damp wood, and fear. Clara slept wrapped inside the rider's old coat near the furnace, while Noah sat awake beside Ghost's saddle, clutching the repaired strap like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The rider stood near the stairs reloading his revolver slowly. His shoulder ached from the earlier fight. His hands felt stiff from cold and old injuries that never healed right. At 45, pain no longer arrived suddenly. It simply stayed. Mara climbed down the stairs carrying another lantern. "They're moving tonight," she said quietly. The rider looked up. "How many?" "All of them." The room fell silent. Even the children sensed something shifting in the adults around them. Mara set the lantern down beside him. Her face looked pale beneath exhaustion. Loose strands of dark hair clung against her skin from melted snow. She had spent years surviving Lost Saints by hiding fear behind sharp words, but tonight something beneath her calm had started breaking apart. "One of Boone's men heard Silas talking at the station," she continued. "Federal inspectors are supposed to arrive in 3 days. Her jaw tightened. "Silas ain't waiting that long," The rider nodded once. He'll empty the town before sunrise. Noah suddenly spoke from the corner. They take the quiet kids first. The rider turned toward him. The boy sat cross-legged beside Ghost's saddle blanket, staring at the floorboards. His voice sounded distant, almost detached, the way children sometimes spoke after surviving things too large for them. The ones who cry too much get beaten. Noah swallowed hard. After a while, nobody cries anymore. Ghost lifted his head immediately at the sound of the boy's voice. The large black horse stood near the cellar entrance where Mara had hidden him from the storm. Steam drifted softly from his nostrils. Even indoors, Ghost remained tense tonight. His ears flicked constantly toward the ceiling above them, listening to the distant whistles and metal groans outside. The rider walked toward Noah slowly. "You know where they load the train?" The boy hesitated, then nodded. "There's another track behind the coal yard." His fingers tightened around the saddle strap. "The little trains don't stop there long." Mara cursed quietly under her breath. The rider looked toward Ghost. The horse already knew. He could see it in the animal's posture, restless, alert, waiting. Outside, church bells suddenly rang through the storm, not loud, not proud, desperate. Father Callow stood alone beneath the awning of St. Abel Church, while snow buried his boots almost to the ankles. The old priest gripped the rope beside the bell tower with trembling hands. His face looked hollow beneath the lantern glow, eyes swollen from sleeplessness and shame. Across the street, townsfolk slowly emerged from their homes. Nobody spoke. They all understood what the bells meant, not prayer. Warning. The rider stepped into the storm with Ghost beside him. Snow immediately covered his shoulders and hat brim. Behind them, Mara began leading children deeper into the hidden cellar tunnels beneath the saloon. "You coming back?" she asked quietly before he left. The rider paused only briefly. "Depends how the night feels about me." Ghost snorted sharply beside him. Mara watched horse and rider disappear into the white darkness. The coal yard sat near the far end of town behind rows of abandoned rail equipment and frozen supply sheds. Smoke from the engines hung low beneath the storm clouds, turning the air thick and bitter with ash. And there they were, children, lined silently beside the freight cars, maybe 20 of them. No coats thick enough for the cold, small faces pale beneath falling snow. Some stared blankly ahead. Others kept their heads down like prisoners already defeated before the journey began. No crying. That was the worst part. A child still crying meant hope remained somewhere inside them. These children had learned silence instead. Railroad guards moved among them carrying rifles and lanterns. Mercer Flint stood near the loading ramp, barking orders through the wind. Snow clung to his red beard and heavy shoulders while his scarred face twisted with irritation. But the man controlling everything stood farther back beside the engine itself. Silas Crow, tall, thin, still. His long black railroad coat looked untouched by the storm somehow. Silver frost rested across the brim of his dark hat. He wore leather gloves so clean they barely looked used. His narrow face carried no anger tonight, no excitement either, only calculation. That made him worse. Men like Silas did terrible things without ever raising their voices. Near the station wall stood Father Callow, frozen in place, watching children board the train one by one. And true to Mara's words, the priest never once looked them in the eyes. Then came the rehook. Ghost suddenly stopped walking. The horse stared toward the line of children with painful intensity. Then Noah appeared. The boy had escaped the cellar. Snow covered his hair and shoulders as he stepped slowly toward the freight cars unnoticed by the guards. In his hands he carried the wooden doll missing one arm. The rider's chest tightened instantly. Noah walked toward the smallest girl in line, a child no older than 6, shaking violently in the cold, and silently placed the doll into her hands. The little girl stared at it, then at Noah, and for the first time in the entire yard, someone smiled, tiny, weak, but real. Ghost let out a low sound deep in his throat, almost like relief. For one impossible moment, surrounded by snow, guns, and steel, the rider saw what this town might have looked like before fear hollowed it out. Then Mercer Flint spotted Noah. "There!" the big enforcer roared. Everything shattered at once. The rider moved fast. Gunfire exploded through the storm as he dragged Noah behind a coal cart. Bullets slammed into wood above them while children scattered screaming across the tracks. Ghost surged forward without command. The black horse charged directly between the children and the moving train, rearing high enough to force workers backward. Steam burst around him from the engine vents. Lantern light flashed across his dark body while snow spiraled violently through the yard. The horse looked enormous, wild, not angry, protective. The rider fired twice toward the guards advancing through the snow. One dropped. Another stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. But this fight felt different from before. The town itself had started turning. Elias Boone deliberately slammed a loading chain into one guard's rifle arm. Another railroad worker opened a side gate for children to escape toward the saloon tunnels. A woman from town grabbed 2 crying boys and disappeared into the storm with them before anyone could stop her. Fear was cracking, and once fear cracked, people remembered they still had souls. Silas Crow watched it all without panic. That frightened the rider more than gunfire. The railroad boss simply turned toward one of his men, a narrow-faced explosives worker named Dorian Pike. The man looked sickly thin beneath layers of winter clothing, with hollow cheeks and nervous, darting eyes. Burn scars climbed one side of his neck from old mining accidents. Silas spoke calmly enough that nobody else heard him, but the rider saw Pike nod immediately before hurrying away toward the eastern rail bridge carrying a satchel. Dynamite, the rider understood instantly. Destroy the bridge, destroy the records, destroy the freight cars, erase everything before federal inspectors arrived. Meanwhile, Noah stood frozen near the tracks as the engine suddenly lurched forward. The train had begun moving. Children screamed around him, but Noah couldn't move. Ghost saw it first. The black horse lunged through steam and snow just as iron wheels thundered closer. Ghost slammed sideways into the boy with enough force to throw them both clear across the frozen tracks. The engine roared past less than a second later. Noah hit the snow hard and wrapped both arms around Ghost's neck. Then finally, after months of silence, the boy began sobbing uncontrollably against the horse's mane. Ghost stood perfectly still beside the tracks while bullets cracked somewhere distant through the storm. And far, beyond the yard, near the eastern hills, a faint orange spark appeared beside the railroad bridge. The dynamite fuse had already been lit. The eastern rail bridge cut through the mountains like a black scar across the snow. Even in daylight, the structure would have looked dangerous. At night, buried beneath a blizzard and hanging above a frozen ravine deep enough to swallow entire trains, it looked almost unreal. Wind howled through the steel beams with a hollow metallic scream that sounded disturbingly human from far away. Ghost reached the ridge above the bridge first. The black horse stopped so suddenly that the rider nearly slid forward in the saddle. Steam burst heavily from Ghost's nostrils. His muscles trembled beneath the leather straps. The horse's ears pinned backward while he stared towards the tracks below. Then the rider smelled it too. Oil, burn powder, sulfur, and something sharper underneath, burning fuse. "They already lit it," he muttered. Far below them, near the center of the bridge, the detached freight car sat motionless against the storm. Lantern light flickered faintly through cracks in the wooden panels. The car rocked slightly in the wind above the ravine. Children were still inside. The rider slid from the saddle too fast and nearly stumbled. Fatigue finally caught him tonight. Hours of fighting, freezing wind, blood loss, and sleeplessness had begun hollowing his body out from the inside. His left hand shook faintly while reloading the revolver. Every breath hurt his ribs. He could feel old injuries waking beneath the cold, like ghosts buried inside bone. Ghost nudged him hard in the shoulder. The rider steadied himself against the horse's neck. Still breathing, he muttered. Ghost remained tense, not afraid, urgent. Below the bridge, dim orange sparks crawled slowly beneath the rails where the fuse burned through the snow toward the dynamite charges. The rider moved immediately. He half slid down the icy embankment toward the tracks while Ghost followed close behind, despite the dangerous footing. Snow whipped sideways hard enough to blind him every few steps. Then gunfire cracked through the storm. The first bullet struck steel beside his head, spraying sparks into darkness. The rider dropped behind the rail supports instantly. Mercer Flint emerged near the far side of the bridge, carrying a rifle. The large enforcer looked even more monstrous beneath the storm lantern hanging from his shoulder. Snow clung thick across his red beard and heavy coat. Blood darkened one sleeve from the earlier gunfight, but the wound had only made him meaner. "You should have ridden south while you had the chance," Flint shouted across the wind. The rider fired once without answering. The shot slammed sparks from the steel beam beside Flint's face. The big enforcer ducked behind cover, laughing harshly. "You think this town's the only one?" Flint yelled. "There's rails full of kids crossing half this damn country." The rider ignored him. The fuse hissed louder now beneath the snow. Closer. Ghost suddenly jerked sideways and stomped violently near the tracks. The rider looked down. One dynamite charge had been hidden directly beneath the bridge supports, wrapped carefully beneath frozen tar cloth to protect it from moisture. The fuse burned through a narrow metal pipe packed with grease. Not amateur work. Silas planned this long before tonight. The rider crawled forward through the snow toward the burning fuse. Another rifle shot exploded. Pain ripped through his shoulder instantly. The impact spun him sideways against the tracks. For several seconds he could not breathe. Warm blood spread quickly beneath his coat. Ghost screamed, not like a horse, like something grieving. The black horse charged directly onto the bridge despite the gunfire. Steel thundered beneath his hooves while the entire structure shook dangerously above the ravine. Mercer Flint fired again. The shot missed wide as Ghost slammed sideways into stacked supply crates near the gunman, knocking them across the tracks. Flint stumbled backward, cursing violently. The rider forced himself forward through the snow. His wounded arm barely functioned now. Blood soaked through his glove while he crawled toward the burning fuse, inch by inch. Then he heard it, crying, small, weak, inside the freight car. 2 children still alive. The rider dragged himself faster. The fuse burned only yards away now. Then came the rehook. Ghost suddenly stopped fighting. The horse turned toward the freight car instead. For one impossible moment in the middle of gunfire, snow and burning dynamite, Ghost walked slowly toward the wooden rail car and pressed his head gently against the door. Inside, the crying stopped. Completely. The rider stared. Even the storm seemed quieter for a second. Then from inside the freight car came the faint sound of tiny hands knocking softly against the wood in answer. Not panic. Trust. Something deep inside the rider twisted painfully. He remembered another winter long ago when a frightened child had hidden behind him during a storm exactly the same way, and how helpless he had felt when he failed to save them. Ghost looked back at him once, waiting. The fuse kept burning. Reality crashed back all at once. The rider lunged toward the dynamite, but Ghost suddenly grabbed the back of his coat in his teeth and yanked hard. The rider cursed violently and fought against him. "Let go." Ghost pulled harder. The horse smelled it first. Not just one charge. Several, hidden deeper beneath the bridge supports where snow covered the rest. The rider realized the truth 1 second too late. This was never meant to damage the bridge. Silas intended to collapse the entire span into the ravine. Ghost dragged him backward desperately across the rails. The rider still struggled toward the freight car. Children, records, proof, all about to disappear. Then the bridge exploded. The world vanished into fire. Steel screamed apart. Wood shattered upward into the storm. The shockwave hurled the rider violently across the frozen ground. Snow turned orange beneath roaring flames while half the bridge collapsed into darkness below. Ghost crashed beside him hard enough to knock breath from both lungs. A jagged piece of iron sliced across the horse's rear leg. The black horse stumbled badly but forced himself upright immediately despite the injury. The rider pushed himself onto shaking arms. The freight car, half of it still hung from the broken bridge edge above the ravine. The children were alive. Barely. Ghost limped forward before the rider could stand fully. Blood darkened the horse's back leg with every step, yet he continued toward the wreckage without hesitation. The rider followed through smoke and falling snow. The freight car leaned dangerously over empty darkness now, held only by twisted rail chains and broken timber. The screams inside sounded weaker. The rider climbed onto the wreck carefully despite his shoulder wound. Wood groaned beneath his boots. Inside, he found 2 children tangled beneath fallen crates. A boy around 7, a little girl younger than Clara, frozen, terrified, alive. The rider cut them loose fast while the rail car shifted violently beneath them. "Can you walk?" he asked. The boy nodded weakly. The little girl couldn't stop crying. Ghost waited outside the shattered doorway despite the flames nearby. The horse lowered himself slightly so the children could cling onto the saddle straps while the rider guided them back across the ruined tracks. Behind them, the freight car finally tore loose and disappeared into the ravine below. Far away in Lost Saints, church bells rang wildly through the storm. Back in town, Mara stood atop the saloon steps, holding the ledger before a crowd gathering in the snow. Her face looked fierce now instead of tired. "These are their names," she shouted into the storm. "Every child this town let disappear." People stared in horror while pages blew violently in the wind. Father Callow fell to his knees nearby beneath the church lanterns. Snow covered his shoulders while tears froze across his face. "I thought survival was mercy," he whispered brokenly. "I thought if they lived through winter." His voice collapsed completely. "God forgive me." But God was nowhere in Lost Saints tonight. Only snow, fire, and the sound of another train engine somewhere beyond the mountains. Then the rider realized something colder than the wind itself. Noah was gone, and so was Silas Crow. The fire from the collapsed bridge still burned against the mountains when the rider found the tracks heading east. Orange light flickered faintly through the storm behind him, staining the snow like old blood beneath moonlight. The wind had weakened slightly since the explosion, but cold still cut through flesh hard enough to feel personal. Every breath scraped inside his lungs. Blood from the rifle wound had frozen stiff across his coat sleeve, turning the fabric heavy against his shoulder. Ghost limped beside him. The black horse's rear leg bled steadily where the iron fragment had sliced through muscle. Each step left dark stains across the snow, but Ghost refused to slow completely. Pain showed itself in small ways instead. The stiffness in his stride, the tension beneath his ribs, the occasional shake passing through his shoulders whenever weight hit the injured leg wrong. The rider noticed every one of them. That frightened him more than Silas Crow ever had. For years, the rider had lived with the quiet understanding that one day somebody would finally kill him. A bullet, winter, infection, whiskey. Men like him usually disappeared without ceremony. But the thought of Ghost collapsing somewhere beneath the snow, that felt unbearable. The tracks curved north through narrow cliffs where old mining routes cut through the mountains decades earlier. Somewhere ahead, a small rail engine echoed weakly through the storm. Silas was not running blind. He knew these mountains. The rider finally stopped beside a frozen signal post and rested one hand against Ghost's neck. "You should stay behind." Ghost flicked an ear but did not stop moving. The rider almost smiled despite the pain. "Stubborn bastard." Ghost breathed heavily through his nostrils and continued forward. The old mining bridge appeared nearly half an hour later. Unlike the Eastern Rail Bridge, this one was smaller and older. Mostly iron beams stretched across a deep gorge filled with frozen black water far below. Years of neglect had left sections cracked and unstable. Snow covered the tracks unevenly where earlier tremors from the explosion had shifted parts of the structure, and there, barely visible through the storm, stood the small engine. Steam hissed upward from the machine, while lantern light flickered weakly through the snow. Silas Crow waited beside it, holding Noah tightly by the arm. The railroad boss looked different now, not broken, but cracked. His dark coat hung open beneath the wind, exposing soot and melted snow across the expensive vest underneath. Blood marked one glove where falling debris from the bridge explosion had cut his hand, yet his face remained disturbingly calm. That was always the worst thing about Silas. He treated human suffering like weather, inconvenient sometimes, never important. Noah looked exhausted beside him. The boy's face had gone pale from cold and shock. Snow clung to his tangled dark hair. One side of his lip had split recently, yet despite everything, his eyes shifted immediately toward Ghost the moment he saw them emerge from the storm. Relief crossed the boy's face before fear swallowed it again. Silas noticed. A thin smile appeared. "That horse's got more kindness in him than most people," he said quietly. The rider stopped several yards away. "Let the boy go?" Silas laughed softly under his breath. "You still think this is about the boy?" The rider said nothing. The wind groaned through the bridge beams. Silas glanced down at Noah, almost absently. "You know why children sell easy?" he asked. "Because nobody asks where they came from." He tightened his grip slightly. No records, no family, no graves waiting for them. Noah flinched but stayed silent. The rider's jaw hardened. "You tell yourself that enough times," he said quietly. "Eventually you stop seeing them as human." Silas looked genuinely puzzled by the statement. "That's the difference between us," he replied. "You think feeling guilty changes what the world is." The small engine suddenly shifted beneath the damaged rails with a loud metallic groan. The bridge trembled. Even Silas glanced downward this time. The earlier explosion had weakened more of the mountain tracks than anyone realized. Another hard gust of wind screamed through the gorge. Ghost stepped forward immediately despite the injured leg. The rider reached instinctively for the reins, but the horse ignored him. Then came the rehook. Ghost walked slowly onto the unstable bridge. No aggression, no panic. The horse simply limped toward Noah through the blowing snow until only a few feet separated them. Then Ghost lowered his head. That was all. No dramatic sound, no command. Just trust. Noah stared at the horse with tears frozen across his face, and suddenly the rider understood something painful. Ghost was not trying to rescue the boy. The horse was giving him a choice nobody in Los Saints had given those children before. For one long second, the entire storm seemed to disappear around them. Then Noah moved. He ripped free from Silas and ran toward Ghost across the shaking bridge. Everything exploded at once. Silas grabbed for the boy and missed. The engine wheels slipped violently against the unstable rails. The bridge screamed beneath shifting steel, and Silas reached for the revolver beneath his coat. The rider fired first. One shot, nothing heroic about it. No quick draw, no speeches, just survival. The bullet struck Silas high in the chest and spun him backward across the icy tracks. For the first time since arriving in Lost Saints, real fear appeared in the railroad man's eyes. Not fear of death, fear of losing control. Silas clawed desperately for the bridge railing as the weakened tracks gave way beneath him. Then the metal snapped. The railroad boss disappeared into the white storm below without another sound. The engine tilted sideways seconds later. Ghost shoved Noah hard enough to send the boy sliding toward the rider before the horse himself stumbled from pain. The rider caught Noah with one arm while grabbing Ghost's reins with the other, just as part of the bridge collapsed behind them into darkness. For several seconds, none of them moved. Only wind, only snow, only breathing. Noah buried his face against Ghost's neck and started crying again quietly. This time, Ghost leaned gently into him despite the pain in his injured leg. The rider looked down into the gorge where Silas had vanished. Nothing remained visible below except darkness and falling snow. No grave, no justice, just winter swallowing another man whole. By sunrise, federal riders finally arrived in Lost Saints. Too late for the children already lost, but not too late to end the railroad operation. The town looked hollow beneath daylight. St. Abel Church stood abandoned with frozen bells hanging silent above empty streets. Some railroad workers had fled overnight. Others stayed behind, waiting for arrest or forgiveness, unsure which frightened them more. Mara handed the ledgers to the federal marshals herself. Her exhaustion remained, but something else had replaced the hopelessness in her eyes now. Anger survived where hope failed. Father Callow never entered the church again. The old priest spent the morning digging graves in the cemetery alone, despite the frozen ground tearing his hands bloody. Nobody stopped him. Nobody helped him either. Some sins stayed too heavy for shared forgiveness. Noah sat beside Ghost near the saloon stable wrapped in blankets while Clara slept nearby. For the first time since the rider met him, the boy looked like an actual child instead of a frightened animal waiting for punishment. "You leaving?" Noah asked quietly. The rider nodded while tightening saddle straps. "You could stay," the boy whispered. The rider paused. Snow drifted softly around them now, gentler than before. "There's no life for kids following men like me," he answered. Noah looked down. Ghost nudged the boy softly in the shoulder. The rider reached into his saddlebag and removed the wooden doll. Its broken arm still hung loose beside the body. That night, beside a small fire outside town, he repaired it carefully, using thin steel wire cut from damaged railroad lines. Ghost stood nearby, watching flames flicker against the darkness. The rider tied the doll beside the saddle afterward, next to older objects already hanging there from forgotten towns and buried people. Noah watched silently from the stable doorway, far away. No words followed. None were needed. By morning, the rider and Ghost rode north out of Lost Saints beneath pale winter sunlight. The church bells remained silent behind them. The railroad tracks disappeared slowly beneath fresh snow. And tied beside Ghost's saddle, the broken wooden doll moved gently in the wind, like a memory refusing to die. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as light from the sky or voices from heaven. Sometimes a miracle is simply the moment someone chooses not to look away. In a world that grows colder every day, there are still people who protect the weak, feed the hungry, listen to the forgotten, and carry pain that does not belong to them. Maybe that is how God still moves through this world, quietly through ordinary souls who refuse to let darkness decide everything. The rider could not save everyone. Ghost could not stop every train. But because they chose to care, some children survived long enough to see another sunrise. And maybe that is enough to matter. In real life, there are people around us carrying invisible winters inside them. A lonely child, a tired parent, someone silently losing hope while the world keeps moving past them. Never underestimate how much kindness, patience, or simple compassion can save a human being from disappearing inside their pain. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who still believes goodness deserves a place in this world. Leave a comment about the moment that touched you most and subscribe to continue the journey with the rider and ghost through the forgotten towns ahead. May God protect every soul watching this tonight. May He bring warmth to those carrying heavy winters in their hearts. And may no child ever grow up believing they were forgotten.